So let's raise the big questions. Is a ban on the BBC documentary on Gujarat 2002 an overreaction? Or is the BBC documentary guilty of pushing what the government says is a fake propaganda? Should the government rebut the documentary point by point instead of banning it? Is censorship a sign of weakness? Is Gujarat 2002 a closed chapter? These are some of the questions I'll raise. Ashok Sajanar is former diplomat. He, remember, is one of those who signed a petition calling for this documentary to be censored and banned. Professor Shruti Kapila is Professor of Indian History and Global Political Thought at the University of Cambridge. Shashi Shekhar Vempati is former CEO at Prasar Bharati. And Shadan Farasat is a Supreme Court senior advocate. Appreciate all of you joining us. I'm also going to go first to P. Sainath, senior journalist and Magsaysay Award winner, who I spoke to earlier, because he has taken a very public stand against the government's decision. Sainath, you've come out very strongly against this government decision to censor this documentary. The government says it's a propaganda film peddling a discredited narrative, which is why they are censoring it, claiming it's pure propaganda. How do you respond? Is the government not entitled to censor something they believe is propaganda?
Firstly, Rajdeep, the question of whether the censorship is justified is itself unjustified. The government has not been able to show us that, you know, when you call for restriction, you show that it is incitement to violence or incitement to hatred or full of lies, in which case you can tell us what those lies are, you can tell us what the thing is, and build some rationale for your action. But I'm saying, Rajdeep, that this takes away from the larger questions within which this whole thing is happening. If this is a question today at all, it's because the punishment has been handed out to the BBC, whose standing and clout in the world of media ensures it gets discussed at all. Rajdeep, much worse happens every single day to Indian journalists, but merits no discussion in a media which has descended largely to its lowest, most cowardly and craven point in its 200-year history. Indian governments have always been sensitive to criticism that emanates from the West, and the present one is landed in a dilemma. On the one hand, we've been telling the public that Mr. Modi has transformed India's image in the world. We can hold our heads high. On the other hand, when something critical of the Modi government emerges from the West, we have to call it a conspiracy. Look at this. Every single index, the UN Human Development Index, the COVID figures are a conspiracy. The UN Human Development Index rating us at 132 out of 188 nations, a conspiracy. The Global Hunger Index, you've said it in Parliament, it's a conspiracy, where we are 107 out of 121 nations. The Environmental Performance Index, where we manage the fantastic score of 180 out of 180, is a conspiracy. And Rajdeep, for you and me, look at the World Press Freedom Index. You fell in the first year of the pandemic, in the 2020, to 142. Now we are 150. It seems that 180 nations of the world have no time for anything else but conspiracies against India.
Okay, that was P. Sainath speaking to me earlier. I'll come back to that later. But Ashok Sajanar, as someone who has signed a petition endorsing this decision to black out the film, claiming it's misguided propaganda, you heard P. Sainath saying all too quickly we call everything a conspiracy. Should the better option have been a point-by-point rebuttal? If the government of India has nothing to hide, if they believe that the documentary is fake, why not a point-by-point rebuttal instead of censoring a film? Censorship is seen as a sign of weakness across the world.
Rajdeep, I think as far as the rebuttal is concerned, it has been delivered. I think on several points it has been delivered. That, you know, first of all, this film is factually inaccurate. It is propaganda because it does not even take on board the fact that the Supreme Court has dealt with the case that the whole issue has been dealt with over the last 20 years. Special investigation team has been put in place in 2012 when the Modi government was not in power, and they have completely exonerated. You know, the motivation, the malignant intent of the film is clear from the fact that, you know, if it is, as the BBC so claims, that it is a rigorously researched documentary, it would have definitely taken on board as to what has happened. Now it has left this question hanging, thereby giving the impression, Rajdeep, that this whole issue has been there for the last 20 years and the courts of India have done nothing about it. And it falls into the responsibility of an organization like the BBC to come out and to dispense justice.
No, but are they not entitled to that? We can disagree with what you say are the motives of the BBC, but are they not entitled, we claim, as Sainath says, to be a Vishwaguru?
No.
Vishwaguru is a
Rajiv, don't misunderstand me. Let them be accurate with the facts. Let them be complete with the facts. When the burning in Godhra, the fire in Godhra takes place, they don't even say as to who is responsible for it. Even Jack Straw, in one of his, who's supposed to be the the fount of all wisdom that has come, because of which all this has come through, he says it was an accident. Meaning, now if you are distorting facts in this manner, you are not presenting the complete information, then what is to be construed? You might not agree with me that it is a motivated propaganda because India is doing so well. Now this is not the forum to discuss Mr. P. Sainath's allegations, but I have responses to all of the charges he has made. And if you have the time to hear, I'll definitely be.
We'll come to them, because what really many want is a point-by-point rebuttal. And maybe there are shades of grey here. But Shruti Kapila, you want to respond to what you just heard? You were on BBC soon after the documentary was aired. You spoke about it and you've written a piece where you seem to suggest that this is not the way a democratic country responds. India, on the other hand, is saying, look, we are perfectly entitled to draw a line. If you put out a documentary which we believe is falsifying information about the Prime Minister, then we are entitled to black it out.
Thank you. First and foremost, just a point of clarification. In fact, actually the BBC documentary, the first...
Unfortunately, your screen is... Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, I just wanted to make a point of clarification. In fact, that the BBC episode does actually state the fact.
Okay, we are having some problem with your line. We'll try and come back to you. You want to respond, Mr. Shadan Farasat? The government's view is, look, the Supreme Court has cleared the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has been cleared of any... Then a documentary comes which suggests that maybe there was involvement of the government. There's a huge question mark over that 27th February meeting where allegedly the government said that the police should not interfere when rioters are on the street. There is no evidence that such a meeting took place. That evidence has been dismissed in a court of law by an SIT. Why should the government of India therefore not respond strongly is the argument that Mr. Modi's supporters make.
See, I have had an opportunity to look at a documentary. I have seen the first part. I think one can have two views on whether you agree with it or not, but I personally didn't find anything which, you need to ban as such. And, the issue of Mr. Modi's role has been in the Indian politics for 20 years. So surely I'm a little actually surprised, even from a perspective of self-interest, why would a government do that? Because it only attracts more eyeballs to the issue. The more you ban, the more people are inquisitive, oh, what does it have, right? So that's number one. But I want to make a larger point about this. I think the challenge today, the government has used the emergency powers under the IT rules of 2021. I think it's very important to understand that government should never have the power to regulate or censor something. Be it the Press Council of India in the context of the textual press, or be it the censor board in the context of cinematographic.
But that's wishful thinking, Shadan. From the time of Indira Gandhi, and we can even go back earlier to Nehru, from time to time, governments do not like to be put under the, have resorted to censorship. It's not something that started in 2014. You have state governments like Mamata Banerjee's who arrest a professor for a Facebook post.
I take your point fully, Rajdeep. I am in agreement with you that this is not just, specific to a political party. It's happened across the board. It happens even today. The point I'm making is this. I think it's important that there are independent, genuinely independent regulators for these kind of things. You can't leave these powers with the government, because what happens then is obviously the kind of bans we are seeing now. And just give one example. BBC has done this documentary. Possibly it does not even suit Rishi Sunak today. I mean, obviously we are engaged, Britain and India are in a negotiation over FTA. I'm sure Rishi Sunak, it's not in his interest to have this documentary come out, but because BBC is an independent broadcaster, right? It is capable of doing it. That's independence for you. So what we need is here independent regulations so that these kind of bans can't be done by the government. You need something genuinely independent. I take your point. Right. This has happened in the past. It happens, it's not limited to one political party. And I think it should be cured across the board. Okay, I think we should take the larger, as opposed to just going to 2002 rule, etc., which we've had for last 20 years. I want to make a larger point as to direct government regulation of free speech. That should not happen. You made
that point. You're saying that governments cannot censor. This should be left to an independent regulator.
Genuinely independent regulator.
Shashi Shekhar Vempati, you want to respond? You've also written suggesting that it is the right step that has been taken. You cannot allow documentaries like this to, in your view, tarnish the image of the country unfairly.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, let me point out that it's a mischaracterization to call it a ban or censorship. This documentary was not aired in India. It was aired only in Britain. It has been made available through iPlayer only for citizens and people who are licensee holders who pay the television license fee in the UK. Whatever content you're seeing on YouTube or Twitter is pirated content. It is copyright protected. So to call it a ban or a censorship is fundamentally wrong.
Shashi Shekhar Vempati, with due regard, the government has invoked emergency powers to get YouTube and Twitter to drop it. So, we are being disingenuous to suggest it's not censorship. It's a form of censorship.
Secondly, to your larger question on, should this kind of content be allowed or, is it right? I think the documentary has several holes in it. It is not an honest exercise. It is not a thorough exercise. It has cast aspersions on the highest court of India. And I think that is a very strong reason why the government has invoked these emergency powers, because you cannot have content of this nature jeopardize the relations between India and UK. And to also respond to your previous speaker's argument that, the BBC is independent, I think there's quite a bit of body of evidence there in the public domain on how the BBC collaborates with agencies of the state of the UK to put forth their state agenda. So I don't buy this argument that, BBC is some kind of an independent entity here. Okay. Also, we must not lose sight of what is happening in the UK, where the BBC is under tremendous pressure over its funding. So it has, started to look at a future which is beyond broadcasting.
So you see the BBC working to some malicious agenda. Whose agenda? Before I move on, whose agenda? Do you have any, are you saying that the BBC is working to someone's particular agenda? Why would the British government agenda be the BBC's agenda on this? Whose agenda?
Well, there are several questions that have been raised in recent months on the alleged political bias, the editorial bias within the BBC. So clearly the BBC is within the crosshairs of the domestic politics in UK. So I wouldn't attribute to any one particular side there, but it's quite evident that whatever the BBC is doing is the outcome of the internal political turmoil in the UK, and that's what is manifesting here. And it's very unfortunate that they've tried to, make India the subject of, this domestic debate that's going on there.
So you're saying there could be, Shruti Kapila, respond to what you're hearing. The BBC's independent
thank you. Thank you. Very quickly, I think it is incredibly damaging for India's international image, the ban. Secondly, the banning something in this day and age is a fool's errand, because you're only going to give it a greater life, a greater immortality, than as it were letting it die, having a kind of like a live debate on these issues. Finally, actually, all the previous speakers are factually incorrect. The documentary does give a very prominent place to the Supreme Court judgment and the SIT judgment, which exonerates the Prime Minister. Plus, you have votaries of the BJP as well as spokesperson for Prime Minister Modi defending his position. In fact, the final word goes to Swabandas Gupta, who's demanding a closure on these events. So all of that this is actually propaganda. This is misrepresentation of what actually the film is showing. But I actually think more than any of this kind of hullabaloo, the problem is really what India's image today might be. Its greatest asset is in terms of its soft power, is that it's a multicultural liberal democracy. With the Ukraine war, all those principles have come up very front and center in the geopolitical arena. This just looks very bad, but it also makes Prime Minister Modi more authoritarian, less in control even of his own people, that he needs to do these draconian measures which are actually associated with China.
So you're saying this documentary, banning a documentary or being seen to censor it, makes the Indian government look bad internationally. You want to respond as a former diplomat, Mr. Sajadar, that the last thing you want is to be seen to be a country that resorts to bans and censorship. If, as I come back to it, if governments have nothing to hide, you know, why do provide free advertising in a way? It's paid advertising almost for the documentary by banning it. That's the worst thing to do. Just allow it to go, let people judge, let people criticize it, rebut what has been said.
Rajdeep, I think what we really need to do is we need to move forward. I think we've really shackled ourselves by discussing this issue for the last 20 years. There has been a closure. We need to get a closure to all of this. You know, there is also, in addition to, you know, the image of the country, the high profile of the country. And I will say that the image of the country has really gone up leaps and bounds over the last few years, you know, whether it is India's economic growth, whether it is G20 presidency, but not going into all of that. You know, there's another reason that has been cited, it has not been quoted on your program, that there was a genuine potential danger of, you know, public order being disturbed, because this being used, because this is again trying to further, you know, in terms of incite.
But there is very little that this documentary, as someone who has covered the Gujarat riots more than any of those, in fact, who are seen in the documentary who are not on the ground, there is very little that is not known. To my mind,
exactly.
Barring the fact that the Foreign Office of Britain has endorsed it, all of this was known in the public domain. I have openly said,
absolutely.
I believe the 27th February meeting, let me be clear, never gave the police the instructions that were claimed by many people anti-Modi. I've been very clear of that. And so have others in this video. So why fear a BBC documentary when many of us have said this for years?
This is no fear, Rajdeep. I think this is basically, we don't want to sort of, you know, continue to discuss all that, because if you are trying to pit the BBC documentary against the Supreme Court verdict, I think you are doing grave injustice to your own judiciary, to your own legal system. The other aspect, you know, when you're talking about the independence of the BBC, let's also see, after 20 years, you know, one report from the Foreign Office is slyly handed over to the BBC to do this documentary, the so-called documentary. Meaning, how can you say that it is an independent organization?
Okay, so you're saying, again, going by the conspiracy theory, but, you know, all the critics in a way of this documentary, Mr. Farasat, make a point that it's a closed chapter. Once the Supreme Court, based on an SIT report, gave Prime Minister Modi a clean chit, why revive 2002 at all?
No, absolutely. And you see the last point...
Let him respond.
Okay, sure.
See, a court will decide something and there will be legal consequences for that. Fair enough. So the legal consequences have or have not flown. But is there any law, even in India, that once a Supreme Court decides a matter, it ceases to be up for discussion? Every day we have articles in newspapers saying Supreme Court got this wrong, this right, in terms of after the final decision has come. So where is the question that because Supreme Court has taken a view on a certain aspect of that fact, not even that's on the personal culpability, may have taken a certain view, may not actually, it's not even, it doesn't even go into that detail, but whatever it is, it doesn't cease to be up for discussion. I think that understanding, I don't know where my friends on the panel are getting that understanding from. Even as per our own law, that understanding does not exist. I'm sorry. Therefore, I'm a little surprised. And I think one thing the government can still do, the second part of this documentary is coming tomorrow, 24th. I mean, none of us have seen it. But I think it'll be good that they don't sort of try and, bar that. That will be at least maybe they, as a hush, as a quick response, they try to, do this. I don't think it helps them. They should actually allow the second one to come through.
Shashi Shekhar Vempati, does it help governments? Would a better attitude, I say from the start, be a point-by-point rebuttal? Take the battle into the BBC's court rather than just a blanket ban which only gives more coverage, more publicity to this documentary, increases the curiosity.
See, first of all, I think this issue has been debated over and over for the last 2 decades. Several elections have already judged Mr. Modi's record, be it as Chief Minister of Gujarat or as Prime Minister of India. And finally, of course, the Supreme Court has, opined on it. So at some point, you have to put an end to it because you have to heal the wounds. I mean, you were talking of the scars of Gujarat right at the beginning. I think it was perhaps Sainath or you, I don't recall. So you have to heal. And how will the healing happen if you're going to reopen the wounds and then raise doubt and cast aspersions? I don't buy this argument that, the documentary was gave a fair coverage to the Supreme Court judgment, because if you look at the documentary, you have people like Christophe Jaffrelot, calling it a superficial investigation and dismissing the entire exercise. I mean, that is, to me, I mean, it looks like the entire purpose of this documentary was to reopen the wounds and poke holes in the entire exercise and keep the debate going. I think that is what is problematic, not is
so
the Supreme Court up for debate
saying
or not?
That the documentary seems to only reopen old wounds. Shruti Kapila, a final word on that, because there will be those who will say, look, there were Hindus also who were killed, Hindu rioters also killed by the police in firing. A fact that the documentary doesn't seem to spend enough time on. There will be those who will nitpick on a particular individual being given a space on it who's seen as anti-Modi. Given all that, do you believe that this documentary is a fair representation? Should it be seen as journalism of the highest order, or should it be seen as the Modi government seems to see it as propaganda?
Let me just say, what marks this documentary out is that it is precisely authoritative. It is authoritative because it has come on the state broadcaster based on an official government report, as opposed to, as it were, civil society action or even indeed human rights actions, on which, as you say, this kind of material has been circulating in the world for 20 years. Secondly, if India really thinks it is a robust liberal democracy, it should show and act in that manner. At this point, it doesn't look like that, because debate, dissension, and actually critical debate over controversial issues is really the touchstone of a true democracy. In banning it, I think it degrades both the Prime Minister's office, his own personal reputation as a world leader, Vishwaguru, but also India's reputation at a time which is an important time in world affairs, as the shape of the world is shifting, and India needs to sort of think about where its, as it were, political ideals and international, as it were, commitments lie, in what sort of principles it wants to stand behind.
Okay,
so quite apart from the details of of who did what to whom when, those are matters of India's politics, which indeed, as you and others have pointed out, are debated, and people, of course, vote on them periodically. But this is actually really shows India's weakness, and actually it costs India, as well as the Prime Minister, his reputation.
One more time, Mr. Sajjanar. Governments usually that are seen to be authoritarian and autocratic are the ones that resort to censorship bans. Governments that are seen to be open are willing to take criticism on the cheek and willing, do you agree with Shruti Kapila, in a year that we have the G20 presidency, do we really need all of this? Do we really need to? We could have ignored the documentary, allowed it to go ahead.
First of all, I don't agree with Shruti Kapila at all. Second is, I don't think fine, as I mentioned, as far as the image and profile is concerned, that's important, but it's also important to maintain law and order in the country. And we have seen how motivated misreporting on certain issues in the recent past has led to communal violence and communal tension in the country. This also, in government's view, had the potential of doing that. And that is why the government has taken this particular decision.
Quick response to what you heard, Mr. Farasat, that this could have led to a law and order. This could have led to a law and order situation.
Yeah, I think public order and law and order is the most touted, excuse by, I'm not just saying about this issue, but generally. But the good thing is that never ever, whenever these movies are banned and the court uplifts them in many cases, when the movies are shown, there's never a law and order issue actually. So this is a description, like you said, Rajiv, we have seen this. Why do we need a BBC? We have seen this on our channels for 15, 20 years. Each one, I mean, Indians will have view on this, one way or the other. Fair enough, no difficulty. You can have two different views. Where is the question of banning this?
Okay.
I mean, there's nothing new to us.
Let me, in a way, as we've heard these voices, go back to what I asked Mr. Sainath, because Mr. Sainath says that this is an example of a declining press freedom and a growing sense of authoritarianism across the country. As I said, many believe that this is, or the government believes this is a discredited narrative, and they are using existing laws to try and ensure that it doesn't result in law and order trouble. How did Mr. Sainath respond to the fact that there are many who are questioning these indexes, Sainath? World Press Freedom Index, authoritarian regimes are higher than India. What does that say? Should we be looking at that really? Is this an issue of press freedom really?
If it's a discredited narrative, already discredited, why are they worried about it? What harm can it do if it's already discredited? But I say again, much worse, and by the way, your point about they're challenging the indexes, of course they're challenging the indexes, and the media are giving them op-ed and edit page space to make absolutely vapid and moronic comments about of every index is open to question. The World Press Freedom Index, and I'll come back to that in a minute, Rajdeep, because I was personally involved in the government's effort to rebut that index. But anyway, just look at what's happening overall. What discredited narrative was there behind the scores of FIRs, nearly 100 in the last 2-3 years, against journalists, against the imposing of censorship, against journalists in this country jailed for up to 2 years without being produced in a court. An entire state, Kashmir, now Union Territory, suffering net blackout for months at a time. Which discredited narrative led to that? Over 3,000 journalists retrenched, laid off, or otherwise thrown out of their jobs, despite Mr. Modi declaring them an essential service on March 24, 2020. How many filmmakers have been bullied, browbeaten, blackmailed, or coerced? Why does the PMO, if they want to blow apart this discredited narrative, why does not the PMO hold a press conference and do so? Despite having brought the dominant Indian media to heel in the last few years, the Prime Minister has a record of being the only leader of a democratic nation that does not hold press conferences. He held one. In 2019, he held one and never answered a single question, leaving that to Mr. Shah. He did not come on to a single issue of controversy. He did not answer any questions. And this was called a press conference. Why don't you do this? I read today in the newspaper that Prime Minister Modi says that we should do away with colonial era laws. No government has used them more extensively than his. In fact, just look at the fact that I would be thrilled if we did away with the laws of sedition, etc. In fact, they have brought in new provisions, new laws, new provisions to old laws like the Epidemic and Diseases Act, under which Samuel Raja Pandian was arrested in Tamil Nadu, the editor of the portal Simplicity in Coimbatore. You know, Rajdeep, when the last journalist was arrested and prosecuted under that law? Bal Gangadhar Tilak in the late 1890s. Now, after arresting Pandian, a few months later, the government brings an amendment not to do away with the colonial harshness of the Epidemic Diseases Act, but to make it more stringent and more powerful. You know, so please don't tell me this about discredited narratives. That I can actually immediately forward to you 100 instances of wrongful arrest and censorship.
Given the kind of, therefore, polarized debate in a way, Shashi Shekhar, let me give you a final word, because Mr. Vempati, we heard Sainath suggests that India has a serious problem when it comes to authoritarianism, both at the state level, I repeat, and at the center, of dealing with the media at times. Do you believe that this documentary, in a way, and the reaction of the government only exemplifies that no government wants to in any way be subject to critical scrutiny anymore?
No, I don't agree with that characterization at all, because I think in India we have a very vibrant democracy, very vibrant media sector. For every pro-government argument, there are hundreds of arguments counter to it, and you see that every day in social media, on digital media, and so on. So I don't quite buy that argument. As far as the indices are concerned, there are serious questions on their methodology, the manner in which they recruit country experts, and there's a whole lot of need for transparency in many of these indices that seem to put India below Afghanistan, for example, on certain things like academic freedom and so on, right? So I would agree with what Sainath is saying. Also, to the larger question that is this exemplifying authoritarianism? No, not at all. I think it's a very meaningful step that the government has taken, because this was copyrighted content, it was illegally uploaded, and it was jeopardizing India's relationships with the United Kingdom. And I think clearly from that standpoint, it made sense for the government to act on this. Also, I think it also puts the spotlight on the BBC's editorial bias, its editorial agenda. And I think there needs to be focus on this within the UK itself, on what future do they envisage for their public broadcaster, because their public broadcaster is jeopardizing their country's relations with the world's largest democracy.
Shruti Kapila, you're smiling as you're listening to Mr. Vempati. You believe this will have no effect on Indo-UK relations?
I just think it's a bit laughable, because I do think that the BBC has proven itself to be independent in this reportage precisely because it has been beleaguered for the last 10-12 years under the Tory government. And as far as the FTA is concerned, there's a kind of massive competitive neo-nationalism going on. If there has been all this kind of ruckus today about this documentary, you've had one of the ministers, cabinet ministers, saying yesterday itself that the country doesn't believe in free movement of people, so it is not even going to restore student visa levels back to where they were, say, about 8 years ago. So I don't think this whole problem of neo-nationalist authoritarian populism is that this is not a contest that only belongs to one political party in the world's largest democracy. If others start stepping onto the scene, you are going to see a fraying of nerves so therefore I don't think this is really about just the FTA or law and order. I think this is image politics. It is image politics of Prime Minister Modi, but also of India at large, and I think that is what we should be considering rather than debating all the other things here.
Okay, let's leave it there. We've heard a multiplicity of voices, which is the aim here on the news today.